Emily Message. I am your Extension Forage Specialist here at Montana State University, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about just the basics of hay production. So what we're going to go over today is just a little bit about kind of what should you be looking for during the hay harvesting process. Some important concepts such as what the optimal moisture range is for the type of bale, that you're producing. How do you get to that ideal moisture? And what's the best maturity at harvest? And we'll also go on to some topics about what can happen post-harvest if we don't reach this ideal moisture range and how that might impact your overall quality. So first off, what we're going to focus on is just what are the optimal moisture ranges and how can we get to that point. So this table has a lot of information there, but basically how it can be broken up is between small squares, which are the first two rows that we see here, or also small rectangular bales. So those are your typical bales that you're going to see on a lot of smaller operations, usually not weighing more than 70 to 80 pounds for some of the larger ones, but as small as 35 pounds on some of the smaller side. Then we have our large rectangular bales. So here you can see they might be as large as 3 foot by 6 foot or 4 foot by 4 foot. These are generally going to be a lot heavier. So you can see in this 800 to even all the way up to 2,500 pounds. So obviously we would be needing to use equipment and unable to move those around by hand. And then we get into our typical large round bale packages. So we can have 4 foot diameter all the way up to 6 foot diameter. And of course, the diameter is going to affect the overall weight of these packages, ranging anywhere from less than 1,000 pounds all the way up to close to 2,000 pounds. So if you look at this last column over here, in the safe baling moisture, we can see that we have different moisture recommendations depending on the size of the bale. So for these first two rows, the smaller square packages, we can have a little bit higher moisture, anywhere from about 16 to 18% moisture. For those large rectangular bales, the larger the bale is, generally the lower our moisture recommendation. So meaning at the biggest size, around that 2,500, the really large rectangular bales, we want to be as low as 14%, all the way up to about 16%. And then for our round bales, again, it's going to vary based on what size your bale is. But for those smaller round bales, generally about 4 foot in diameter, we can get away around 18%. The larger we go, the lower the moisture. And here on this table it says about 16%. I would actually argue for those 6 foot diameter bales, you might want to be closer to 14%. And the reason for these differences in recommendations simply has to do with the surface area to volume ratio. So once we have this forage baled up in these different packages, depending on the size and how much we put into one bale, it's going to affect how much forage is in contact with the elements. So with, say, solar radiation or with any sort of wind current, that can help decrease the overall moisture. The smaller the package, the larger our surface area to volume ratio will be. So that just means more of the forage is exposed to further drying elements, such as that wind or sun drying. For these larger packages, like this 6 foot diameter round bale, a lot more of that forage is going to be contained on the inner part of that bale. So this means that if we're at a little bit too high of moisture, it's not going to have the opportunity to dry down. And as we'll talk about later, that can significantly affect the overall value and quality of our hay, as well as affect animal performance, which of course is not something we want to be dealing with. So overall, the general recommendation is that you always want to have your hay at less than 20% when possible. Again, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later, but if our moisture is above 20%, we significantly increase the risk not only of mold formation, but also of hay heating. We generally like to try to keep our moisture above 12%, again, when possible. And the reason for that is that the drier that we get below that 12%, and particularly below 10% moisture, we see an increase in leaf shatter, which also is going to decrease our overall yield, as well as our overall quality again. So when we look at a typical forage that's out in the field, a grass or an alfalfa, before it's harvested, usually it's about 80% moisture. Now, if you remember from the last slide, what I was saying is we want to have it at maximum of 20% moisture. So that's a significant amount of water that we're going to have to lose. If you want to think about it this way, for every 5 pounds of forage that you have just sitting out in that field, 4 of those 5 pounds is actually going to be water. So only 1 of those 5 pounds is going to contain the nutrients that we are going to be feeding to our animals. So that's a lot of moisture that we need to be losing. Now for hay, like I said, our general recommendations are somewhere in that 14 to 18%. We also have more and more haylage and silage being produced here in Montana. And that doesn't need to be dried down as much. In fact, we only need it to be dried down to about 60 to 65%. And the reason for that is that we actually need that moisture to help in that preservation and ensiling process. But we're not going to get into that for this talk today. So what's going on with that forage drying? Well, we typically break it down into 3 different phases. And the first phase is what we would call stomatal loss. So what this means is it's the easily lost moisture that's going to escape out of the pores in that leaf surface. So generally that is going to be starting, again, at that fresh forage moisture of 80%, and we will lose down to about 60% moisture, so that 20% moisture loss. It is critical that we lose that initial 20% as fast as possible. Because what happens when we get below 60% moisture is that plant effectively stops respiring or stops going through its processes to create regrowth or to use up some of its energy that it normally would be doing had we not harvested it. When it tries to regrow, when it still is respiring, it's using up energy that is then going to be lost and not available to the animal at feed out. So anything that we can do to to speed up that dry down time is going to help us in the long run and help preserve, in particular, those total digestible nutrients. So we'll talk about one of the easiest things to do is using a conditioner attachment, which is going to, as we'll talk about, physically help remove that moisture. And also another thing we'll talk about later on is windrow formation and just the size of that windrow or swath and its exposure to things, again, like that solar radiation or wind current. The second phase of moisture loss is going to be loss from the leaf surface as well as the stem. And again, conditioning and windrow formation is going to help us with this. But that's going to bring us down to about 30% moisture. So again, a significant amount of moisture is going to be lost during this particular time. And then the final or third phase of moisture loss is that really tightly held water. And a lot of time that's going to be in the stems, and generally the thicker the stem is, the harder it is to lose that portion of water. And this is where that conditioning is really going to help, particularly with broadleaf plants or those thick stem plants, with a lot of grasses as well. So as you can see here, breaking stems or scraping that cuticle, the outer surface or barrier of that plant, can really help speed up this final phase of drying and really help to get us down to under 20% moisture, which is our target goal. So how are we losing nutrients out in the field? Well, as I already talked about, plant respiration is one. And again, the faster we can dry down our forages, we're going to have a decrease in that respiration. And what's happening there is just those plants are taking sugars, and they're converting those sugars to water and carbon dioxide, again, through kind of that photosynthesis reaction. And so if we prolong that drying, which sometimes we can't necessarily control because environment is going to play a role here, we can see a significant decrease in the nutrient quality of that hay. Another thing that we're going to talk about is, of course, other things that we can't really control, such as rain, which is going to cause some leaching of nutrients, and then other things that we can control, such as mechanical manipulation like raking. When that's not done at the appropriate time, we can actually increase our leaf loss, which is where most of our nutrients are going to be stored. So what are some things that we can do? Well, one thing that I commonly get asked is, what height should I cut at? And I always say, it depends. So obviously we know the closer that we harvest to the ground, we're going to have more yield. And it's been estimated that in alfalfa, at least, we can gain about ½ ton per acre in a highly productive alfalfa stand per year per inch. So ½ ton per acre per year is nothing to sneeze at. So they're talking about, the lower you go, the better. But When we look at cutting closer to the ground, we also have a negative effect on stand life. And that can be due to harvesting off regrowth. So in alfalfa, one thing we can think about is that if we're harvesting when it's later in maturity, that plant may have already started to regrow from some of those crown buds. If we harvest too close to the ground, we can actually cut off some of that young growth, which is going to cause that plant to have to expend even more energy to start regrowing all over again. For these long-shooted species that I have here, so that's where the apical meristem, or the growth point, is lifted pretty far above that soil surface and easy access. An example would be like a smooth brome grass or a timothy plant. Okay, that can make it really hard or more energy intensive for that plant to regrow. Orchard grass, which is in the middle here, is actually what we would consider a short-shooted species. So with that grass species, we can get away with harvesting a little bit closer to the ground because its apical meristem, or point of regrowth, is closer and a little bit more guarded, so that even if we harvest a little bit lower, we may not necessarily be taking off that point of regrowth. But also what it does beyond decreasing stand life, harvesting closer to the soil surface can decrease forage quality. When we look at what plant part is generally going to be higher or lower quality, what we see is that we generally are going to lose 5 points in RFV, or relative feed value, per inch that we cut closer to the ground. Now, RFV is an estimate of forage quality that's used for marketing purposes, and it just kind of gives us a comparison among like types of hay. So a higher RFV number generally is going to mean higher quality. So if we're losing 5 points per inch closer to the ground that we're harvesting, what that means is that we're losing quality. And additionally, as you can see in this last point, we also have the ability to pick up more ash. Now, ash is important because it contains minerals, so it's good to have some ash in our forage. But soil is also considered to be ash, and so if we have soil contamination, that can overall lower our forage quality and generally may not be nutrients that are going to be available to our animal. So from all this, what we generally recommend is to try to harvest between 2.5 and 3 inches for all forages. This will give you that optimal trade-off between both yield and quality, and as long as you have an adequate regrowth period or rest period for your forages, you should not negatively impact stand life. Now, after harvesting, one other additional option that we have is using a conditioner. And most producers that I interact with do use conditioners in their harvesting process. We have generally 2 main types, although there are some newer ones that are on the market, which I'm not going to cover today. The 2 main types that we see are what's called flail, or also known as impeller conditioners, as well as a roller conditioner. So the top picture that I have over here is a flail conditioner, and these are most suited for grass harvesting, and what you can see is that these individual tines will actually pick up this grass or the forage, and it's going to physically cut that waxy coating, and that's going to again promote that moisture loss. And these tines can actually scrape that forage against this surface in the back here, and that's where we'll see that cuticle being broken or that waxy surface. This bottom picture here is what we'll call a roller conditioner. This in particular picture, we have 2 rubber rollers. We can also have steel rollers. We can also have rubber and steel rollers. These are particularly suited for alfalfa. And what happens is that plant will be passed through these 2 rollers. And if you can see this kind of chevron pattern here with those intermeshing rolls, that's going to not necessarily break the stem, but it is going to bend it so that we will have small breaks in the stem, which is going to help release that tightly held moisture and speed up our dry down time pretty significantly. So again, here is just more pictures. We have the roller conditioner over here. We have the flail conditioners over here, and it just kind of gives you an idea of exactly how they work. One question I get, especially with the roller conditioners, is which is best? Should I go for rubber, or should I go for that steel? And when we look at waste, that's really the biggest difference that we see. And generally with those rubber conditioners, the waste is decreased just a little bit compared to those steel rollers. But overall, overall, a lot of times it's going to come down to cost and which is more available and easier to get. When we're talking about decreases in waste, generally it's only about 1 to 2%. So you would have to really pencil it out and figure out what's going to work for you on your own individual operation. Now here's some research that was done evaluating how effective these individual conditioners are. So in this graph here on the left, this was looking at alfalfa. And we're starting off again up here around that 80% moisture. And the blue line represents an impeller or a flail conditioner, while the red line represents that rubber roll conditioner, And as you can see, after we get down past this about 55% moisture, that's where we see these conditioners really splitting off and having a different impact. The roller, we can see it generally is going to get down to that lower moisture a little bit quicker than that flail impeller, or that flail conditioner is going to. And so we're reaching this 20% moisture quicker than if we would have used that flail conditioner on the alfalfa. Now if we look at grass hay over here, again we have the blue line is looking at the flail or impeller conditioner, the red line is looking at that roller conditioner. That flail conditioner significantly reduced the time. It was more apparent even than in the alfalfa, where we're seeing that this flail conditioner got it down to 30% in about 55 hours post-harvest, where at the same time that roller conditioner was still at over 50% moisture. Okay, so significantly increased dry down time, and there is a difference in effectiveness between the two types. So we always recommend using a roller conditioner for alfalfa, and we recommend using an impeller or a flail conditioner for grass. One of the other things that we can see, and one of the other reasons that we recommend a roller conditioner for alfalfa, is exactly what's shown here. So this is a picture after a flail conditioner was used in an alfalfa field, and you can see all of the leaves that were left on the ground here because that harsh flail conditioner, the action of actually rubbing that forage against the back of that conditioner was too much, and it basically stripped the leaves off of that plant. And again, most of our nutrients, particularly in alfalfa, we have about 70% of our nutrients located in the leaves. So you're leaving a lot of protein, a lot of energy, a lot of minerals behind if you do choose to use that flail conditioner on alfalfa. So some other just kind of tidbits as far as how machinery can impact your overall forage quality. So a disc cutter bar has actually been found to have a little bit higher levels of ash in the hay, so again that soil contamination. And kind of a general rule to go by, if you have a forage quality analysis done in grass, if you have an ash content that comes back at higher than 6%, that's when we would begin to suspect some soil contamination. For legumes, it's going to be a little bit higher, partially because they generally have higher mineral content. But if we see a legume come back at higher than 8% ash, then again, that's when we know that there has been a little bit of soil contamination. So some disc mowers that are touted to be able to pick up more hay or get that hay off the ground, and even also marketed to be able to get that lodged hay off the ground, they use these knives that are going to go really close to that soil surface to be able to pick up that forage. But because they're closer to the ground, they're also closer to soil or to the ash, and so again we see a little bit higher ash contamination when we use those sort of mowers. I'm going to talk here a little bit about rakes. Rake can make a big difference as well. So this was a project that was done, and I'll show you some data from it, that was done with Minnesota, Wisconsin, as well as Penn State. And they were looking at 4 different types of rakes and which had the highest amount of ash contamination and which had the lowest amount of leaf loss. And what they found is that these wheel rakes, or these ground-driven rakes, where they are actually working by having the tines roll over the soil surface, which is causing their movement, they generally had that highest ash potential, or the highest potential for soil contamination, as well as increased leaf loss. The 2 rakes they used that were PTO driven were the rotary rakes and the mergers. And because they're not requiring to be ground driven or have that movement across the soil surface to operate, they generally had the lowest soil contamination as well as the lowest leaf loss, which I'll show you. But of course, as most things go, with these rotary rakes and the mergers, generally they are going to be a little bit more expensive than your wheel rakes and other options that are ground driven. So again, that's something that you're going to have to pencil out and see what's going to work for your individual operation. So here are just some of the results. This was the part where they were looking at the percent leaves. And again, the reason that that's important is because most of our nutrient quality is contained within that leaf. And so the 4 rakes that they were looking at was the rotary rake, which again was PTO driven, the wheel rake and the sidebar rake, which were ground driven, and then this merger, which also is PTO driven. And similar to the results with the soil contamination, the rotary rake and the merger rake had the highest levels of percent leaf in that finished baled product compared to the wheel rake and the sidebar rake. Again, about a 1% decrease, which doesn't seem like a whole lot, but again, if 70% of your nutrients are contained in those leaves and you're losing 1% of your leaf just at the raking operation, that can lead to a significant decrease in overall forage quality. So just another thing to consider when you're talking about equipment and considering what equipment to be using on your own operation. So other things that we have to, recommendations for avoiding raking losses: try to keep your forage on top of the stubble. Again, it's just going to allow a little bit more protection, and it's going to help to decrease that soil contamination by not coming in contact directly with the soil. If you can avoid tines touching on the ground, that's going to help improve overall leaf retention as well as decrease that soil contamination. And then, of course, the biggest thing that came from that project is that there really is a difference between the type of rake, and that's going to impact your overall quality losses and soil contamination. So again, generally the more expensive ones, those merger and rotary rakes, they're going to have lower loss, but they're going to cost more. So you'll have to evaluate what your return on investment would be with them and if it's really going to pencil out. But the ones that are ground driven, like the wheel rakes and the sidebar rakes, again, we generally are going to have a higher leaf loss as well as more soil contamination. And a final thing I'm going to say about raking, because I do get this question, is when should I be raking? And of course we know that there's an optimal, right? If we rake too early where we haven't lost a whole lot of moisture, we're probably not going to be very effective. But if we rake when it's too dry, what we're going to see is improved or increased leaf loss, just because, again, we're going to have that leaf shatter because we've lost so much moisture already. So this was a project where they were looking at raking at 70% moisture, 60%, 50%, 33%, and 20%. And when we look at this first column, it says percent DM or dry matter lost, so that you can kind of think of as it's an estimate of yield. So how much are we actually losing of our forage? And that number is pretty minimal, just around 2 to 3%, until we get down to this 33% moisture. And here we lose about 7% of our overall yield, which is pretty significant. When we get down to 20% moisture, we're losing about 12% of our overall yield. Again, that's a lot of that forage that is not going to end up in the bale. When we look at the leaves, it mimics pretty much exactly on that dry matter losses, down to about that 50% moisture, where we jump up a little bit to about 5% of our leaf loss. One thing that's important to consider is that when we're losing dry matter during raking, most of that dry matter is actually going to be that leaf portion, okay? We're going to be losing a lot more of leaves than we are of stems. So again, we're leaving a lot of nutrients on the ground. When we get to 33% moisture, we're losing about 12% leaves, and 20% moisture, we're losing about 21% of our leaves, okay? So about a fifth of our overall leaf, which again is going to have a major impact on forage quality. So from this and other research, what we generally recommend is that 40% moisture is the minimum moisture that you're going to be raking at. You probably want to shoot between that 40 to 50% moisture to have the biggest impact without affecting your overall quality as well as quantity. And why do we care? I've said this so many times already because it's a common theme here when we're talking about harvesting. Not only do we want to have the yield, but we want to retain as much of that quality as possible. So overall, we care because the leaves contain most of the nutrients, okay, especially the nutrients that are important for animal production. Summarized, we can see that it is impacted by type of machinery, so make sure that you're using the right conditioners for your type of forage, whether it be grass or a legume, and also make sure that you're raking at the appropriate moisture. Don't bale too dry, okay, or rake too dry, because that's going to increase your leaf loss. And then, as we'll talk about in a little bit, rain can cause a significant impact on leaf loss as well. And again, this is something that's going to be a little bit harder for us to control other than looking at the forecast and making our best decisions. One other consideration, and if you ask Dr. Dan Undersander, who was my colleague at University of Wisconsin till recently, he just retired, but he's one of the foremost researchers in alfalfa production, and he said that one of the biggest things that you can do, one of the most important factors in harvesting and getting that rapid dry down is swath width. And a lot of times this does not mean going out and buying new equipment. You might have to change some of the settings on your equipment, but changing from a from a narrow to a wide swath, or what some might call windrow, can have significant impacts on increasing or decreasing that drying rate. So this is some of his research here in this graph, and this is a summary. They sampled forage samples or hay samples over several harvests as well as different locations, and so this is a summary of all of their research. And then the dotted line here shows if they used a wide swath, and that represented 75, that swath or windrow was laid down and it measured 75% of that harvest width. Okay, so the width that they were cutting with their swather, what they put down behind them measured about 75% of that. With this narrow swath line here, so that solid pink line, that was a swath that was laid down that was only 25% of that harvested area, so significantly smaller. And again, we're starting at about that 80% moisture, and you can follow with this wide swath, we got down to 20% moisture here in about 32 hours. And this is in Wisconsin, which is a pretty humid environment, and we know that the more humid it is, generally the longer it's going to take to dry down. So that was pretty significant, okay? Getting dry in less than, 2 days. With our narrow swath, look at how much longer it took us to get down to that 20%, about 56 hours. Okay, so if you could save yourself that much time out in the field, imagine how much you're saving in quality. And they did analyze quality with this trial. They were what they presented was some quality changes when they were looking at haylage, so they were only trying to get to about 50% moisture. But what they found was with that wide swath, they had significantly higher energy as well as protein compared to forage that was harvested using a narrow swath. So overall, their recommendations is if you can have your swath be about 72% of your harvest width, that would be optimal. Now again, it's going to depend on your tractor and how far apart your tires are, because you don't want to be driving over any of your swaths if at all possible, because that can lead to other issues as well. But make those swaths or windrows, whatever term you use, as wide as you possibly can, because that will significantly help you in the overall process. Okay, so getting into some of the things that we can't control. Of course, we know that rain is going to affect our overall quality, but I want to talk about exactly how much of an impact it's going to have. I have listed here sunlight and temperature as well. I'm not going to have time to get into that today, but generally if we have larger amounts of sunlight, so if we have non-cloudy days, bright, shiny days, that's going to help speed up our dry down time pretty significantly compared to overcast. Temperatures as well, and again, I think that we're all pretty aware that if we have a higher temperature, especially when it's dry and not humid, that's going to lead to faster dry down. Humidity is going to play a large role, and that has to do just with that moisture gradient with the outside, with the environment, compared to inside that leaf. We're pretty fortunate here in Montana that we're in a semi-arid environment, so usually we don't have a whole lot of humidity, which is going to mean that water is going to be released out of that leaf or that stem a lot quicker than in areas like where I'm from in Pennsylvania, where we generally do have a lot of humidity. So it is going to take a little bit longer. But again, I'm going to focus just on rain impacts on forage quality for today. So 3 primary reasons that rain is going to lead to decrease in forage quality and yield is due to leaching. So that's actual when the rain is going to take those water-soluble nutrients and remove them from that forage. They're going to be lost from that forage. Also respiration, and we talked about that. Again, respiration is going to be that initial loss where that plant is still respiring, still using energy and going through its processes. And if we get rain during that time, it's going to keep that moisture above 60%, which is going to prolong that drying and increase the amount of nutrients that are lost. And then, of course, leaf loss, which again, I think it speaks for itself at this point, but rain, again, because we're increasing that dry down time, can lead to leaf loss, which is going to lead to overall nutrient loss. The biggest thing, if you don't take anything else from this portion of the presentation, is that intensity can play a huge role in what we can expect as far as overall losses. So if you have rain coming your way, or if you're looking at maybe having time, you have 2 storms coming at you, you need to figure out which storm to go in front of. A low intensity rain that lasts for a long period of time is generally going to have higher leaching and higher nutrient loss compared to a really hard rain that happens in a short period of time. So even if it delivers the same amount, even if both storms deliver 1 inch of rain, but one was over a longer period of time, that's generally when you're going to see that increased nutrient loss compared to 1 inch that happens really quickly. Okay, so just one thing to consider when you're trying to figure out, should I go out there and cut my forage? So some research has been done looking at, all right, so we have rain coming. What does it mean? Well, in Wisconsin, what they found was that after 1 inch of rain, they lost 22% of their alfalfa. And alfalfa seemed to have more damage than other forage species, such as grasses, where we're just having that higher leaf loss. Okay, it's a little bit more susceptible to that leaf loss compared to our grasses. In that same study, and they were mimicking this by actually applying the rain, if you will, the water themselves. So in their treatments that did not receive any rain, they lost only 6.3%. So again, that's mainly from that mechanical movement of the forage during the harvesting process. So that's a pretty significant loss, 22% compared to only 6%. And that means a lot of dollars out of your pocket. Also, the timing of the rain. The closer to harvest it is, actually the better if you can time it in any way. The farther out it is, or what we would call partial drying, is generally going to have a larger impact. And that's again because when it's still, when it's almost dry, or say we've got down to about 30% and then it rains, it's going to prolong that drying pretty significantly. So if we can harvest and we get rain that same day, it's not going to be as negative as if we harvest and then got rain 2 days later. Okay, it does increase the respiration losses, and again, it's going to increase overall dry matter losses. Another study found that when they were applying rainfall to forage, they actually lost 34%. And again, this is one of the research projects where we get this recommendation. If they spread their rain or their moisture application out over a longer period of time, that's when they saw their highest losses. So again, trying to have the really hard rain that happens only over a short period of time is going to be better than those lighter but longer term rains. So what Iowa State came up with looking at all of this data is that for every inch of rain received, you can expect to see a dry matter yield as well as digestibility decrease by about 5 to 10%. So again, that's pretty significant, especially in areas of the country where it's not unusual to get 1 to 2 inches of rain in a single storm. Again, we're pretty lucky out here where we don't usually have to worry about that, although it can happen, and we have seen it happen. But that's a pretty good rule to follow with that 1 inch of rain, a 5 to 10% decrease. So what's happening in the leaching process? So we talked about what you can expect as far as losses. During that actual leaching process, that's when these soluble carbohydrates are going to be removed from the forage. And the soluble carbohydrates are important as far as an energy source for that forage. So when we're looking at that TDN calculation, the total digestible nutrients, on our forage analysis, it's taking into account these soluble carbohydrates. So if we have that rain that causes that significant leaching, that TDN number is generally going to go down. One thing that often surprises people is that crude protein is not a water-soluble nutrient. So generally, we're not going to see changes in overall crude protein. Now, what we can see are changes in available protein, but that's due to something completely different, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But what happens as we lose those soluble carbohydrates is that our fibers, okay, are going to become a larger percentage of the overall dry matter. So that generally means that digestibility is going to be decreased. And studies have found that digestibility can decrease anywhere from about 6% all the way up to 40%. So again, some pretty significant impacts. So if we have the choice, we would hope for that heavy rain over a short period of time to minimize those decreases, with with those impacts going to be maximized with that more prolonged rain. So this is just some data that from a project that was looking at the quality impacts from rain, and this was in alfalfa. Okay, so this was looking at no rain control in the first column here. Here was rain, so this was about an inch and a half during the curing process, so before they got it baled. And then this last column here was where they got about 2.5 inches on dry hay. So it was completely dry, already baled, and then they got the rain. When we look at the protein, again, as we said, it was not really affected. So what affected it more was the harvest maturity. So here they harvested early at late bud, and then a little bit later at first flower. But looking at the effects from no rain to rain or rain on the dry hay, really not that much different. We do see a slight decrease in that first flower from 18.1 to 15.6% protein, but again, it's not that much different. Where we really see the impacts is looking at digestibility. So with no rain, we were having about 73% digestibility at that late bud stage. That decreased all the way down to 57% when we had that 1.6 inches of rain during curing, and then down to less than 50% when it was occurring after the hay was dry. When we look at this, the TNC, or total non-structural carbohydrates, okay, again, those were significantly affected as well. And that's again because both the digestibility and the TNC contain that soluble carbohydrate portion. And so when we see that late bud going from 4.65% with no rain all the way down to over 50% loss with rain, 2%, and then look at this, down to about 1.2% TNC with that dry hay. And again, we're going to see that directly reflected in animal performance, so not something that we want to have happen. When we look at our fiber, and we'll just look at one of these, I like to look at the ADF, which stands for acid detergent fiber. In ADF, we often use as a correlation with digestibility. Higher levels of ADF are generally going to be less digestible. And that ADF number will increase as that plant matures because it's just accumulating more fiber. So we can see that with the no rain, we were pretty low, about 27.5%. That's a really good quality forage. When it got rain, it increased all the way up to 38.5%. And again, that's a direct correlation with that decrease in digestibility. And that's happening because not necessarily we're not accumulating more fiber, but we're losing those soluble carbohydrates. So as a percent, that fiber is increasing. And again, we see with the rain on the dry hay, a little bit higher even at 46%. So again, we're just increasing it even more later on in that drying process. And the final part that I'll just point out is this lignin. Okay, so that is that polymer that is going to help with that structural rigidity in that plant, but it's completely indigestible to animals. We would like to see those lower lignin percentages. But because we're losing those soluble carbohydrates with rain, it's going to increase from about 5.5% from no rain up to almost 12% when we got rain during curing, to over 10%, 11.5% in that dry hay, which is a pretty significant level. So again, we're seeing that reflected in that decreased digestibility. So what does this mean for you? Well, number one, it's some big decisions, right? Especially if you're facing some inclement weather and you're trying to figure out, do I go harvest it now, or do I wait, or do I do it early? Really having an idea of what is coming at you will help, but now hopefully some of this information of how longer rains versus shorter rains are going to affect your quality can really help make that decision. If you have a storm coming and it's just going to be unavoidable, try to plan to harvest immediately before that rain comes to, again, minimize the damage that it's going to cause, minimize that loss in quality. You're obviously going to, from the data, going to lose a significant amount of soluble nutrients for that prolonged period of rain compared to a really short rainfall, but both are going to make it a little bit harder to get to that desirable moisture. It's going to take a little bit longer, and unfortunately, it's going to have to sit out in that field a little bit longer. So, what happens if you don't get it down to that ideal moisture, if you don't get it to less than 20% or less than 16% for those larger packages? Well, the two main issues I have are browning and molding. So with browning, okay, this is a picture that's pretty typical of a brown forage, or a forage that has gone through that heat damage, and we can see the inside core of that has become heated. And what's happening in these reactions is that soluble carbohydrates are actually binding to protein and making that protein unavailable. Okay, so it tastes good to the animals. If you gave this bale to a bunch of cows, they're probably going to go and sit and park themselves on the middle of that bale because it tastes really good. Almost similar to the reaction that's occurring when we cook onions, okay? When we caramelize those onions, it makes them nice and sweet. This is a little bit similar to that. And what happens during that process, so during that heating reaction, is that generally, again, we're going to have a little bit higher moisture. And so that higher moisture is going to lead to this reaction where those proteins and those carbohydrates bind. And what's going to be produced as byproducts of that is more moisture as well as heat. So it basically forms this vicious cycle where it's producing more moisture, which furthers that reaction, and then it keeps producing more heat. We see that forages that are 50 to 80% dry matter, which means 20 to 50% moisture, are more susceptible. So again, that's where we're getting that recommendation of always bale less than 20%. The reaction requires water, so that's where that moisture is going to be really important. When we get to that 20% moisture or lower, that 80% dry matter, which again is our recommendation, generally we don't see this occurring. It's really tough because there's just not enough moisture to allow this process to occur. And if this heating, if this browning reaction is severe enough, that's when we can actually see those spontaneous hay fires occurring, which can destroy structures. And I've seen some pretty horrific videos online of hay in transport that caught fire. And so, of course, that's something that we want to avoid. So what can we do? Number one, best to minimize heating that occurs, especially after baling and definitely after we're loading it onto a truck or into a barn. We do know that after we harvest and bale up a forage, we are going to see an initial increase in both moisture as well as heat. That's normal, and it's called sweating. As long as we are at that less than 20% moisture, generally it's not going to start that vicious cycle. It's going to heat up. It's actually going to cause some of that excess moisture to evaporate, and then we will slowly see that temperature decrease and that moisture decrease. It takes about 11 days to get to that stable equilibrium of temperature and moisture. So if the sweating process begins and there's too much moisture, that's when we see this vicious cycle occurring, and that's when more moisture is going to be produced rather than evaporated. So you always want to make sure that you have your hay harvested and baled at the appropriate dry matter level. And again, 20% is that maximum that we want to be at. For those larger packages, we want to be even lower because we don't have that additional drying occurring due to sunlight as well as wind current. What are we looking for? So what I usually recommend, if you don't have a bale thermometer or a thermometer large enough to reach to the middle of those bales, because that's where this reaction is going to be, is to try to get like a thin metal rod or crowbar. Works really well. And you have to be careful when you're doing this. But if you stick that crowbar into the middle of your bale and leave it there for 10 minutes, if you pull it out and it's cool to touch, then you're usually fine. Okay, you don't have to worry about it, and you can go ahead and load your bales up. If it's slightly warm, you do not want to load your bales onto a truck or into a barn. You actually want to kind of leave them out by themselves. So if that crowbar is a little warm to touch, and you want to continue to check. It could just be part of that natural sweating process, or it could mean that you're a little bit too high in moisture and you potentially have some heating occurring. If you pull that crowbar off, and always be really careful, don't just grab the crowbar because you don't want to get burned in case you do have some heating occurring, but just keep your arm or hand kind of close to it so you can feel what the heat is coming off. This is where we're starting to get in trouble. So if that crowbar is hot, you want to make sure to move any bales that are testing as hot away. Just in case, if that heating occurs, they're not going to come in contact with other hay and make the fire spread even further. If you have a thermometer and you're testing and it's over 175, or if it's really hot, that's when you probably want to call the fire department, because at this point you're probably seeing some sort of smoke coming from those bales. You want to make sure that you have water nearby, just in case, again, we have any sort of significant heating that continues and that bale isn't able to dry down. Then the second thing that I worry about is mold growth, and this is pretty common. Even if you bale up your hay at that ideal moisture at less than 20%, if you have it stored on the ground, on the soil surface, there is moisture in that soil, and a lot of times we are going to see mold growth occurring there as well. Just hopefully it doesn't penetrate through that bale. With mold growth, we generally see that occurring when it's around 20 to 35% moisture, and this is problematic. Number one, because molds can cause respiratory issues when animals are putting their nose down into that forage and we have that mold, that dust. It also can lead to production of carbon dioxide in water, and this process can actually use up some of the nutrients. That mold growth can use up some of those nutrients, which is going to decrease the quality. It can also lead to heating. And then one of the biggest issues, excuse me, is that depending on the mold species, some of them can produce some what we call mycotoxins, which are actually toxic if consumed to animals, especially in their appropriate amounts. So be very careful. If you do have mold growth, you probably want to have it tested to see what species it is and in what quantity. So just be very careful and just be aware that this can happen. And again, it is common for hay that's stored on the ground, or I see it a lot in our research where we were looking at pyramid stacking your brown bales, where the water sits in between those bales. We do have some mold occurring. If you can get rid of those areas on the bale, that's great. Just be aware of what impact it can have on your animal performance. And also overall, if you're trying to sell your hay and there's a significant amount of mold in there, it can reduce its value, especially if you have people that are looking for that. So again, just a couple negative impacts to consider when looking at the impacts of mold. And the final thing I'm going to get into here really quick is when should you harvest? So as we know, forage quality decreases as that plant gets more mature. Okay, so when we look at this graph here, we've got crude protein and leaves, and that's decreasing as we go from leafy or vegetative all the way up to full bloom. But what's increasing is the stem and fiber portion over here, which also means our yield. Okay, so when we're talking about when to harvest for hay production, it's a trade-off between quality and quantity. Now, if we were in Wisconsin or Minnesota, I would be talking about harvesting early because we want to optimize the quality or the nutrients that we are getting. Because I'm in Montana and we're a beef state, we're generally more concerned, especially with something like alfalfa that's already high quality, with quantity. Okay, we want to make sure that we have the tonnage there, but of course we still want to make sure that it has decent quality. So we want to be looking at that ideal trade-off as to when we can get the most tons produced that are going to be nutritious enough to feed our animals. Here are some numbers just looking at impacts of not only the different maturities, so from late vegetative all the way to mature, but also species. So here we have some legumes as well as our grass species, represented by orchard grass and tall fescue. So focusing on this first column, we're just going to look at alfalfa again for time here. That TDN, total digestible nutrients, that's an estimate of energy availability. And we see as that plant matures, we go from about 63% TDN, which actually is lower than I would expect for a lot of alfalfa that's grown in Montana, decrease all the way to 50% when we're fully mature. So that's a pretty significant drop in overall energy availability. When we look at the crude protein, which is represented by CP here, okay, it starts off high, and again, I would expect it even higher if we were really immature at that late vegetative stage here in Montana. But we're about 20% crude protein, decreasing to about 13% when fully mature. So we recognize that we're going to have this quality decline. But what's also really important is this last column, which stands for relative yield. So if we were to harvest for this optimal forage quality, this really high TDN and high crude protein, we're going to be giving up a lot of yield. We're only at about 70% of our optimal yield. Okay? For beef production, we don't necessarily need that. A lot of times, the maximum crude protein that we're going to need is about 12%. The minimum TDN we would need is 52%, and for animals that are producing late gestation, early lactation, they're going to need more than that. Okay, so we would be looking somewhere around that early to full bloom, depending on what animals we're feeding. But we see that we don't get up to that 100% yield until we're at that full bloom or late bloom. But if we harvested a little bit earlier, maybe around mid-bloom, so 50% bloom, we're at 95% of our optimal production, and we're still at pretty darn good energy and crude protein. Okay, so that's looking at that trade-off there. I will point out that for grasses, it's even more dramatic when we're looking at that relative yield. So if we harvest really early at that early vegetative stage, we're at less than 50% of optimal production. Okay, so probably isn't going to make sense to harvest that early for grasses. We don't reach 95% of yield until we reach that mid-bloom stage. Okay, but we've declined pretty significantly in our TDN from about 72% to 57%, and that crude protein has gone from about 18% to 11%. So again, just looking at those trade-offs and how maturity is going to affect that. And when we look at species impacts, again, overall, we would expect our legumes like alfalfa to have really high average daily gains, so that's pounds of live weight per head per day on the y-axis here. Our annual ryegrass they were using as a cool season annual grass is still going to be really good quality, so that's another option. But what I see a lot more commonly is going to be something like a cool season grass with a legume mix, which is represented by the orchard grass white clover here. Still going to produce really great gains, okay, but it's going to be a little bit higher than just our grass by itself, which was represented by their tall fescue. I'm not going to get into that today, but we would expect to have a little bit higher gains with tall fescue that didn't have an endophyte. This particular one did. And so further, just kind of showing how do we represent quality and how does that affect our value of hay. So these are some standards that are used in Midwest hay auctions for different hays. And you can see they're looking at crude protein, our fiber values, as well as that RFV number, and how that's going to affect auction prices. And these are older prices, okay? You can see these are an average from the late 80s to early 90s. So of course that's going to be a little bit lower than we're seeing now, but the trends are still relevant. As we decrease in quality, especially going from, say, that prime quality, that 19%, down to less than 8% protein and RFV of less than 75, we're going to cut our profit in half. Okay, when you look at those auction prices, this was on average going for about $135 per ton. This lowest quality, that quality 5, was about $60 per ton. So again, it's going to pay to harvest perhaps a little bit earlier to get, you know, the higher protein or middle grade protein, mid-grade fiber, and mid-grade RFV to still be maximizing and getting a decent profit for our hay. Overall guidelines to consider. And this is for grass hay. It's going to be very different from legumes. Generally, we consider premium for grass hay to have a crude protein percent over 13. For legumes, it's very easy to be over 13% protein. As we drop in quality and get less than that 5% protein, That's what we would call utility hay. Okay, so not very good. Basically, it's going to be straw, not have a whole lot to offer to that animal, and you will have to supplement if this is your only forage source. So just some more numbers. These are numbers from Montana, looking at alfalfa cut at different maturities. One thing that they looked at that I really like, they looked at the percent leaves. Okay, so at bud, so fairly early on, we were close to 50-50 leaves and stems, about greater than 40%, and that's directly reflected in that high protein as well as that high RFV number. As we matured, we accumulated more stems. We had a lower leaf to stem ratio, which meant lower overall percent leaves, lower protein, higher fiber values, which are shown by the ADF and NDF, as well as overall lower RFV. So again, this is going to impact how much that hay is worth. And how, of course, we're in Montana, so we want to know how is it going to affect animal performance. So this was looking at, again, that quality on steers and gain. And just as you would expect, as we had higher quality with higher protein, lower ADF, we improved our pounds of gain per day. So they were getting about 2.2 pounds of gain per day per head. That's an efficiency of about 7 pounds of forage fed per pound of gain. As we increase to this lowest level, so about 14% protein and really high fiber, around 43, we decrease that pound of gain to less than 1 pound of gain per day. And look at that, we had to feed about 16 pounds of that forage to get 1 pound of gain. Okay, so it actually pays in the long term to have slightly higher quality. Maybe we don't need 23% protein, but even if we're looking at 20 or 17, somewhere in there, where we can be getting closer to that 2 pounds of gain per day, that's really going to pay off in the long run because it's just less amount of forage that we're going to need to be feeding. And this just shows you the difference between those. That first one, that high quality, was a vegetative. Okay, so we're probably not getting a whole lot as far as yield goes, which is not going to be ideal in our situation. But if we were harvesting, say, at early bloom, getting that 17% protein, we would still be getting fairly acceptable gains, and I think that we could actually even improve on that even more with our alfalfa harvested here in Montana. So overall, that's all I had for you. Feel free, if you have any questions at all, to email or give me a call. I'm always more than willing to help anybody in any way that I can, and to offer more information if there's any questions that I didn't cover or didn't have time to get into better detail with this. So thanks so much for listening, and hope to hear from you.